Hello and welcome to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, with myself, Mark Vernon, and Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert.
Hello, Mark. Good to see you.
You too. We get together partly because we meet in person, in the flesh, with people who are interested in the Philosophy Slam as a kind of performance. They call out words and we riff using insights from philosophy, from psychology, from other parts of the great world of the mind that we've touched on in one way or another, and thought that we could try this online. So Philosophy the Slam, the podcast, was launched. And what we do with the podcast is take two words and use them as a kind of, well, sometimes they resonate, sometimes there's dissonance, sometimes there's spurious links, sometimes it turns out there's quite deep links. Because sometimes what happens in Philosophy Slam, where we're doing it in the flesh, is that words start to link up and a kind of mood grows across the group. And we thought that'd be interesting to explore in the podcast, as well as a way of turning it into a podcast. So, Robert, we need a couple of words.
Yeah.
And one of the sorts of words that comes up every so often, which I often find interesting, are colours. So I thought that we might have yellow as one of our words today.
Yeah.
And then you thought of a word that comes up quite often as well, which is the word identity.
Exactly. In fact, we have had yellow called out to us at one of our slams. I think it was at the Century Club in Soho, where we have a fairly regular gig. But yeah, identity does come up quite a lot, doesn't it? So those are two good words to look at. Sometimes we should say we also derive words from a random word generator on the internet as well. But today, yeah, we'll look at identity and yellow, maybe draw some robust or spurious connections between the two of them.
Very good. Well, look, shall I get us going? Because the word identity does intrigue me, because it's one of these words that has really changed meaning in quite a sort of subtle but actually very pronounced way. Because the older sense of identity was when things were identical. So you might say there's an identity between two people. And then philosophers might discuss whether that means there's only really one person, if it's a true identity, or whether you can have people, say, being identified with difference as well. And the point there, though, is that identity is used to show similarity, if not actual replication. And the identity of the red ball and the red sun might suggest some sort of resonance between two seemingly disparate objects. But what's happened in more recent times is that identity has come to be associated with who you are, who I am, as separate individuals, as if identity is something I possess as an isolated entity. And so you get the spin-off then into identity politics, which is the fight in the social space to be able to celebrate, keep, maybe even assert your identity. And, in a plural culture, much structured by the value of the individual, identity politics therefore becomes a really big part of what can go on in a society. But it does fascinate me that in that move, identity, rather than being about connection and similarity, even identity, as in the same, has come to be about who I am in a way different from you. And so identity has become kind of privatized, strangely. Now, there may be more to say about that, but that was the first thought that came to my mind when this word identity was called out in the slam.
I really like that, Mark. Yes, we do use the word still as to say, there's an identity between two things. And we use the word identical to describe two things which are the same. But I think you're right. Identity has become a point of differentiation. And along with the notion of identifying, I identify as X rather than Y. That may pool into a tribe, I identify with this tribe or that tribe, but it's still, as you say, perhaps more about separation than connection these days. I also think that notion of identifying as separate from somebody else points us to another aspect of identity, which is what makes us identifiable. I am identifiable as, male, for example, or white, or whatever I might be. But that doesn't necessarily touch who I am on the inside. It's like that identity is that which allows me to be identified, but doesn't necessarily speak to my inner self. Now, I think this is an interesting question. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who is a late 20th century writer writing in the phenomenological tradition. And he was much preoccupied with this question of identity. And at a certain basic level, he's writing in the tradition of Kant, Immanuel Kant, and sort of hints exactly at this point that at some level, identity is simply what persists over time. Like, I recognized you when you came on the call today, Mark, because you look pretty much the same as you did last time. I mean, slightly different, but, identifiably the same. So there's a question of time that relates to identity. You've got to be more or less the same now as you were the last time. So identity and time are actually very closely connected. Now, we know we all change over time, but it has to be slow enough for the identity not to be disrupted. If you suddenly turned up today and you were, 10 inches shorter or 5 inches wider, or, your beard color had changed or something, I might really have some questions about your identity there. So he makes this point about identity over time, which I think is a fascinating one, actually. You can't really think of identity without time, because you need 2 points in time to be assured that it's still the same. You don't know what sameness is unless you've got something to compare it to from what was before, which I like the idea of. But then he also goes on and makes a distinction which sounds very technical, but I think can be translated into easier terms, which is really a bit like the distinction between who and what we are. So I designed a course last year called Who Am I? And the first exercise I invite people to do is to answer the question, who are you? And then reflect on whether the question, who are you, is different at all from the question, what are you? Because if I ask you, Mark, who are you? You might say, I'm a writer, I'm a philosopher, I'm a former priest, and so on. And I could object to that and say, well, Mark, that's great. You've given me lots of answers there, but those are answers about what you are, not who you are. And you might then feel sort of justifiably taken aback and go, oh, right, okay, so who am I then? How do I begin to answer who am I? And Ricoeur calls this difference between who and what identity. He has Latin terms for them. Idem identity is the who, which is the deeper, never-changing thing. And the idem identity is the who, and the ipse identity is the one kind of over time allows you to be recognizable, but might actually subtly change in some way. So that's one way of thinking about it. But none of those meet your objection, really, which is about identity being, again, about the discrete entity of the I'd entity, rather than I'm now identifying with other people.
That reminds me of an old conundrum, I think. I think it's called the conundrum of Theseus's ship. And it's the idea that if you rebuild a ship, in this case, but it can be anything, replace, first of all, the mast, then you replace the sails, then you replace the planks on the deck, and then you replace the hull because it's got a bit rotten, and then you replace the tar. So in other words, every part of the ship has been replaced. Is it still the same ship as before? And very fascinating. I mean, that applies to us, because I think it is the case that every 7 years, every cell in our body will be new. So when you get to a venerable old age, it's not long until you're totting up your body having been replaced 6, 7, 8 times more, even, which is kind of bizarre, really. But nonetheless,
you look the same despite that massive sort of changeover of cells.
Yeah. So it then raises this question: what is it that contains or holds or transmits or preserves your identity. And I certainly like the idea that the body, which is changing, is a kind of manifestation or a reflection of what you might call a soul. There'd be different words, different ways that you could describe that, but something that you might say, to use Aristotle's definition of the soul, is the kind of form of the body. It's that which exists in a non-material realm, but yet shapes the material manifestation. And that sort of sense then that our identity rests in something that's more subtle, that might, whilst preserving continuity through time, as you're saying, also have a kind of flexibility about it. Materially focused identity has this kind of mechanical quality. It's got to be somehow like the replacement of the parts of Theseus's ship. But maybe there's a kind of identity which is more sort of organic. It's a more unfolding. In Aristotle's terms, it would have to do with identity really resting in the potential that then throws up actuality, becomes actual, but the potential can become actual in different ways. And so this notion of soul and identity, I think, is very valuable. I mean, I think it's actually also quite valuable in terms of identity politics, because what it allows people to recognize is actually their identity can be sort of robust, but at the same time responsive and adaptive, and changeable. And so keep the exploration of your identity more in what you might call a play space, rather than it too quickly becoming too concrete. And that can lead people into all sorts of trouble, of course. But anyway, identity and the soul and potential, and then the actual, and then of course, when I recognize you coming on the screen too, of course. But what's fascinating really is that when you recognize a person, even when meeting on a screen, you don't really recognize them as a body, but you recognize them as a body that is manifesting a soul. If you met someone as a body, they'd be a corpse. But when you meet a living person, of course, you recognize their soul, as it were, shining through their body. So their identity resting at that level of our being.
Gosh, there's so much in all of that, Mark. And I do want to start introducing the notion of yellow and connecting it a bit to this concept of identity. But a slightly tangential thought that came up to me then, as you were talking about us recognizing each other on screen, was the fact that actually we're only seeing head and shoulders of each other at the moment. And it reminded me that in literature, but more broadly, there is a trope called synecdoche, which is a Greek word. And what it means is you can identify the whole from the part. Now, human beings, generally speaking, when they go on Zoom calls, are going to show you their head and shoulders rather than their feet and ankles and calves, because the synecdoche works better, generally speaking, from the head and shoulders. So I know it's all of Mark there, even though I'm only seeing the head and shoulders. The most famous example, usually, when you're teaching literary theory or whatever, is to talk about the fin of a shark. So the fin comes towards you, as in the famous Steven Spielberg film Jaws. And it's a brilliant example of synecdoche, because all you're actually seeing is, of course, the fin. But from the fin, you infer the whole shark, and particularly the teeth of the jaws of the shark. And so that, for me, is quite an interesting idea, that to identify something, you only need the part in order to infer the whole. There's a Latin phrase, pars pro totis, the part stands for the whole, basically. And of course, the whole world of online is all about pars pro totis and synecdoche. So it's interesting that you don't need the whole to get the whole. You just need a part of it, or a soupçon of it, which is different, again, I think, from the notion of the soul, because the soul isn't a part. In a way, it is the whole or something, because in a sense, although I'm only seeing a part of you now, Mark, your upper body, and inferring the rest of you from that, I still feel I had the whole of you, not the whole body, but I feel like Mark is there. My friend Mark is there. The whole person is somehow there. which is interesting.
We mustn't forget yellow, but you mentioning that leads me into actually a whole theory about the nature of reality, which is that it is all based on synecdoche, or I rather like Coleridge's words. He talked about tautogori. So it's a bit, allegory is when links are made through difference, but tautogori is when they're made because of the same. There is, in a way, back to your last thought there, what the soul in this theory of reality, it's quite theological really, is a part of, is the divine whole. So it's this reflection on how we're made in God's image, would be a Christian way of putting it. There's other ways of putting it in different traditions, but the idea is that the value of certainly a person, and you can argue the value of all things ultimately, is that they are reflections of the whole, which is actually the divine. So the whole doesn't actually rest in us, but rests in what you might call our true self, which would be the divine self. But anyway, look, there is, I think, a bit of a link here to yellow that's also occurring to me, because I think this also explains what is quite a strange remark that figures like Plotinus made, which is that you can only perceive something when you have some identity with it. The famous remark is, he says, there must be something of the sun in our eye in order that we can see the sun. And see doesn't just mean sort of register it like a machine sort of registering the presence of the light or something. But it is this deeper appreciation, which we're touching on there as well. So it's feeling the warmth, but also feeling the significance, the meaning, and so on. And so the idea there is that, say, take one aspect of the yellow of the sun, that has a meaning to us because partly of the meaning of the word yellow. You know, that yellow isn't just whatever it is, maybe about 500 nanometer wavelength of light, say, but is an experience, is a feeling, is a presence. You might even say that yellow has a kind of soul, because of this animate quality that it just inevitably has to us. If you paint your room yellow, it feels very different from if you painted it red or painted it green. And that's not just about the other things that you have in the room, but it invokes a certain kind of presence even. So anyway, this link between identity, our connection with other things, I think can be mediated through colours. Colours not seen as part of the electromagnetic wavelength, spectrum of light that falls within the visible wavelengths, but as itself part of this dynamic sort of vital quality of everything around us.
That's terrific, Mark. And I'm sort of bursting with all the things that my synapses are fizzing, or whatever, if that's the right word. There is, I think, you mentioned sort of theology, and, one can't help making that connection between yellow, the sun, and the divine. I'm pretty sure that in Vincent van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo, I remember reading, when I read them a long time ago, that Van Gogh says, yellow really is the sort of most profound color because it has this sort of almost theological quality to it, which I don't think he makes an explicit reference to the sun. But, if you look back at the sunflowers, it's the most famous example. They seem to have an extraordinary depth of presence to them, which may or may not be theological. I also thought of another painter in the Dutch tradition, Willem de Kooning. There's a painting by him called Rosy-Fingered Dawn at Louse Point, Rosy-Fingered Dawn being a reference to Homer, which allows too for a kind of, a bit like looking at Turner paintings, I suppose, for the idea that the yellow of the sun, as it emerges from the rose colours of the first light, has something divine about it. Just in a sidebar, if anybody's particularly nerdy about art history, as I am sometimes, there are two amazing essays on that painting. One by Jeremy Prynne, the Cambridge poet, on Rosy-Fingered Dawn at Louse Point, and one by Will Gompertz, the art critic as well. But anyway, so there is, I think, perhaps something theological about the colour yellow. But I wanted to go back a bit and connect it to identity. I've got downstairs in the kitchen, I've got lots of mugs for drinking my coffee in the morning. And they're all different colours, but all made by the same company called British Colour Standard. Now, British Colour Standard are a bit like Pantone in attempting to classify and define what different colours are. So one of these mugs is Indian yellow. Okay, now debatable. Maybe there's all sorts of questions there about culture and identity and all the rest of that. But it has made me think, at what point do you call yellow yellow on a spectrum? Because I'm trying to picture a spectrum. At a certain point, yellow tails off and becomes lemony and almost white. The other end, it becomes orangey and then red. So at what point on that spectrum, this is like a Zeno's paradox type question, I suppose. At what point on that spectrum is yellow yellow? Undisputably not Indian yellow or saffron yellow or sunflower yellow. So I think there's a question about identity and color there, because if, as you were saying at the beginning, identity involves separating out from things that are not yellow, where do you draw the line? Because presumably there has to be a line that says this is yellow and this is not yellow at some point. And yet, as far as I know, that is a very kind of dark art to know where you draw the line, because presumably colors like numbers can be infinitely subdivided. I mean, I'm far, far, far as it possibly can be from being a mathematician. But as I understand it, in number theory, one of the big questions is always, where do you draw the line between 1 and 2? Where does 2 actually become 2 when you don't have an empirical thing like 2 oranges in front of you rather than 1 orange? So I think there is colors immediately, I think, ask this question about the identity of colors and the separability of one color from another.
Yeah, so when does yellow lose its identity as yellow and become instead red? Very fascinating. And I like that in our thoughts we have moved towards this pliability, this kind of living response to things, and come up with notions to do with soul and so on as well. But look, Robert, as ever, 2 words takes us quite a long way. And so thanks so much indeed. If you enjoyed this Philosophy Slam, the podcast, do subscribe, of course. And Robert, we will be back with more words to link and connect.
We will. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Good to see you.